Another option is to buy the 200mm f2 lens and then use a 1.4 teleconverter with it. It gives you a 280mm focal length with an f2.8 aperture. The f2 lens is super sharp and is as sharp wide open as the 300 f2.8 lens is. With that combination, you also have the option of using the 200 just as a 200. It produces that characteristic long focal length, shallow depth of field look.
For those times when you need even more compression, a 2x teleconverter can help. Here's an example of how sharp this combination can be. But it's extremely important that the electronic shutter release be used, because at this magnification, any wiggle is also magnified. That truck in the background was at least 200 feet away. Well, with a shorter focal length lens, that background truck is hardly a factor, and other things like the sky and the gravel lot become too much of the image. So I used the 2x multiplier or the teleconverter on my 200mm lens to make it an equivalent of a 400mm lens. That makes far objects look larger and closer. That distant truck filled the background very nicely. One thing to know about teleconverters, though, is that the higher the magnification, the softer the image gets, because you're also magnifying lens imperfections. I wanted a better background than the brown siding to use behind some trees, so I placed my 6x6 background there. But 6x6 is pretty small, so I needed to use a lens with a very narrow angle of view. So it turns out that I needed the 200mm lens with the 2x teleconverter. I tried my 1.4x teleconverter, but it wasn't long enough. And again, the sharpness of the 2x converter was certainly sufficient.
This is an okay photo, but the relatively high angle isn't very flattering. A low camera angle makes her look taller. This highly professional diagram shows the concept. A 200mm lens covers the scene without seeing beyond those trees in the background. If we lower the camera to make her look taller, then we'll see over the tops of those trees in the background. Since this is a low to mid-key image, a bright sky at the top would be distracting from our subject. The answer is to use a longer focal length lens and move the camera back, then place it low to the ground. The narrower field of view of a longer telephoto lens keeps us from seeing over that row of trees. The image on the left has a bit of a snapshot look. The one on the right is much improved because not only does it help her look taller, but it lowers the horizon, so it doesn't cut the photo in two, and the background is less distinct. I ran into a situation that called for a really long focal length. This senior's duplex was across the street from a very interesting scene. I liked how those weeds looked against that distant hillside. But it's too far away. So as I walked closer, my view was too low and those weeds ended up into the sky. So I had to stay back and shoot long. Starting with a long telephoto of 300mm, it was clear that this wasn't enough. Adding a 1.4x was better, and good for a full-length portrait. But I didn't feel there was enough impact. The doubler did the job. But at 600mm, You got to be careful to take whatever steps are necessary to make sharp images. You might be wondering if you can use a teleconverter on a zoom lens. The answer is yes, as long as the lens you're using is sharp to begin with. You see, a teleconverter basically magnifies the center portion of that lens. So if it's soft, it'll get softer when multiplied. I'm okay with using a 1.4x multiplier on my Canon 70-200 2.8 version 2. It's very acceptably sharp. The 2x is acceptable as well, but then the effective aperture gets to be pretty small. The lens goes from being a 200 f2.8 to a 400 f5.6. But as long as your subject is far enough from the background or you're doing relatively close-up images like this, it's completely fine.
Although a 300mm f2.8 lens can give you backgrounds anywhere, I think it's important to show an example of where a long lens doesn't help. The background is already sufficiently obscured here, with just enough detail to know what's there. This was photographed with a 200mm lens at f4. But using a 300mm lens only further blows up the background to just mush. So if the background is already magnified and blurred, there's no need for a longer lens.
I'll show a few different head and shoulders portraits to show what are the most pleasing focal lengths. It should be pretty obvious that a wider angle lens is not good for close-up portraits. Most photographers agree that with a full-frame sensor camera, about 85 to 135 millimeters produces the most realistic and attractive look. You can go longer than that recommended focal length, but not shorter than the recommended focal lengths. I'll discuss a few things that contribute to sharp focus. Keep in mind this is for SLRs.
Accurate focus is essential to me, so I bought the Lens Align device to help check and adjust the focus accuracy of all of my lenses and camera bodies. This is software that makes micro-focus adjustments automatically. My particular cameras require a bit of user input, but the software instructs me where to set the micro adjustments. You can use a spotlight to use as a focusing aid when it gets too dark to see through the camera and the camera can't autofocus. With SLRs, you need to select the focus point nearest the eye, and that takes time on every shot, which I find annoying. The center spot on many SLRs is the most sensitive for focusing, but unless your subject's faces are in the center, you don't want to use it. Instead, use the focus point that's closest to the face in the final composition. For long focal length lenses, you'll be farther from the subject. So recomposing results in only a tiny tilt and focal plane shifting. So you can use the center focus point. One of the many great things about mirrorless cameras is their iFocus feature. All of that focus point hassle is eliminated. Just point and shoot.